Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. Once again, thank you for joining us. Today we have a very enlightening presentation on conducting performance reviews. Mr. Tony Scucci is going to speak to us today and facilitate this call. I do want to remind you that your phones currently are on mute, but if you would like to speak, you can hit the little hand button to raise your hand and I can unmute your speaker, as well as you also can write any questions or comments in the chat or question window. And I believe Tony will be able to answer those as they come up, so feel free at any point in time to definitely raise your hand or put your question into the box. So at this point, I'll turn it over to Tony. Tony, are you there?
I sure am. Can you hear me?
I can.
Great. Thank you, Kimberly. And welcome, everybody. And thank you also again, Kimberly, for helping with all this technical stuff. I really appreciate your support in all this. Today we're going to look at conducting performance reviews. And because there's a relatively small number on the webinar, I'm hoping that we can have some conversations back and forth. So please feel free, again, if you'd like to speak, ask a question, or make a comment, to just push the little icon that has the hand, and Kimberly will unmute your phone, and then we'll be able to speak back and forth. The other thing I'll say about the webinar is that we are recording it, and it will be archived at the NCUIH website so that you have access to it whenever you might like to, if you want to share it with other staff or other board members. And then finally, let me just kind of draw your attention to the bottom right of the screen, my email address here. As I always do, I invite anyone on the webinar, if you have any questions or comments, anything you'd like to follow up with, you can reach me at that email address. I always respond within 24 hours. A question or comment, some resources you might be looking for. I have a lot of good information I'd be glad to share with anybody who would like it. So again, I put that out there as a reminder to you to just consider me a resource person anytime after this call. We're going to look at performance reviews, and there are two broad goals for this webinar, really. And one is to really look at how to improve the performance review process, and even in a bigger picture, to really look at encouraging an evaluative culture in your organization. So the idea is to really get people to be more and more okay with every now and again stepping back and assessing how they're doing and giving each other feedback so people can improve their performance. The webinar is really designed, was originally designed for board members and for executive directors, and it was really set up to look at how boards could do performance reviews of the executive director. They've adapted it, and really everything in this webinar can be applied to either boards and executive directors or to supervisors and subordinates. So if you're an executive director, you might be participating on this call with the idea of sharing some of this with your board for your own performance review. You may be an executive or some other staff person who supervises people, and you might want to look at this as a tool or process for doing performance reviews of the people who report directly to you. So I'll use the terms interchangeably: board and executive director, and supervisor and supervisee. And there's two specific things we want to accomplish here, really to look at performance reviews and try to get an understanding of what it is we're talking about and why it matters so much. And we'll also look at some tools and some processes for assessing employees' strengths and weaknesses. And I like using this tool, assess, rather than evaluation, although you'll see the word evaluation in here in a few places. But I really believe in the idea of doing an assessment. It's the social work in me. It's the idea of looking at an employee and looking at what do they do well, where do they need to improve, what are their strengths, what are their areas for improvement. And it's a different way of thinking about things in my mind than evaluating, which is more about how do I give somebody a score. This is really about how do I improve somebody's performance. So these are the objectives for the webinar. And it's laying out a sequence for what we're going to do in this time. We're going to look at performance assessments. There's one slide where I have several questions that I would hope would stimulate some comments or discussion from you all. We'll look at some areas that you would include in a performance review or a performance assessment. And we'll look at the steps in that process. I will share with you some samples of an assessment tool that I use. It's just one of many tools. It's one that I like to use. I've used it for a while now, and you'll see some samples of that to give you an idea of the tool that I use. And you'll hear me say this at least one more time in the webinar, but what really matters is that you have a good enough tool. What matters more than the tool is the process. Having a process, a really sound process, is the most important thing, and the tool should always support the process. No tool really stands by itself. We'll look at some SMART goals. I'm not sure how many folks are familiar with the acronym, but we'll look at some ways in which this is an acronym and is kind of a framework for establishing performance goals for the person that you're evaluating going forward, and then to use those performance goals as a measure throughout the year in terms of the person's performance and progress they're making towards those goals. And then there's a couple of slides that I think are interesting around commitments to a better partnership, because I understand this to be not just supervisor-supervisee. I understand it to be a partnership between those people, that the supervisor and the supervisee each have a vested interest in the other one doing their job well. And then we'll evaluate this session, and there'll be an opportunity afterwards where you'll get a link to an evaluation form. Would really encourage everyone on the call to respond to that questionnaire and give us some feedback. Feedback is like key to the way we improve these webinars. Feedback also is a key to the way you improve performance with employees. So finding ways to get honest, direct feedback is like critical. And so we welcome and encourage you to give us feedback on this webinar, and also to share some ideas around other topics for webinars that you might like to see going into the future. There are 3 themes that will emerge in this webinar, and these themes come up in a lot of different trainings I do. One of the themes really has to do with performance tied to a person's sense of purpose. Most performance problems really are problems that have to do with a person not really having a strong enough sense of purpose. So to improve performance, we have to improve that sense of purpose, that what I'm doing in this job really matters, that I'm really making a difference somewhere. So you'll see that theme throughout. One of the things that I always, when folks talk to me, they'll call me and they'll say they've got this problem with some employee, and they'll tell me about this is like one of those high-maintenance employees, and they'll go on and on about the problems with the employee. And my first question is always, who hired this person? Because when you think about that, when you have a problem with an employee, you're really looking at this third theme, which is that any problems you might have with an employee, somehow you're implicated in those. And the best thing to do is to reflect on how you might be implicated, how you might be part of this problem as a first step in trying to address it. So that's the third theme. The second theme that I kind of jumped over is the notion of attending. We do so much of our work kind of on autopilot, and in order to improve performance, as a supervisor, we have to get the supervisee out of autopilot. It's one of the reasons why you do a formal performance review once a year. Something special is happening once a year. It's a formal process. It's not the day-to-day job. It's a time to step back and really assess what this year was like and what are some of the goals we might establish going forward. So getting out of autopilot is an important part of this whole process as well. When you get out of autopilot, that's the first step in improving performance. So these themes will kind of emerge as we go through the webinar. And again, I'll invite you, if you have any questions or comments or thoughts, please feel free to share them anytime. You can type them into the chat box, or you can click on the hand to raise your hand, and Kimberly will unmute your phone. 3 key points in all of this. A performance assessment process is really designed to provide a context for strengthening the relationship. So it's the context that you have. Very often when I supervise people, I would meet with them on a regular basis. And we meet once a week or once every 2 weeks. And it would be the opportunity to just sit down, turn off the phone, shut the door, and just ask the question, how are we doing? How can we improve? So it's a context for doing this work. Secondly, is that it really helps clarify what the expectations are and ensures that there are good accountabilities. Being clear with the person you're supervising, what is expected of them, is really important. And it's a way to hold them accountable for what's expected of them. And it's also a process that acknowledges and rewards significant accomplishments. You know, people working day to day, there's always something positive about getting a pat on the back sometime and being acknowledged or affirmed for something that you did that might have been particularly difficult or challenging. something you struggled with and were successful with, or something that you struggled with and perhaps weren't successful, but you gave it such a good effort. So a performance process, really, if it's going to be effective, it has to really address these kinds of issues. This next slide really looks at some questions that we can kick around here on this webinar, so I would invite you to think about how you might participate here. We're talking about a process that I was saying earlier where you're assessing what the employee, what the supervisee does well, doesn't do well, areas that they could improve. What are some of the obstacles that get in the way of them improving their performance? And those obstacles can be a technical skill that they need to develop further. An obstacle could be there's some other issues going on in their life and they have to figure out how to resolve those so they can get their mind back on their job, whatever it may be. When you think about doing this, there's a real benefit to the organization. So when you think about it from the board's perspective or from a supervisor's perspective, how do you see the organization benefiting from doing performance review? What does the organization get from this? What are the reasons or the purpose behind why you would do this? If we were talking about your board doing a performance review of a chief executive, of the executive director, one of the ways your organization benefits is that it's a way to hold that person accountable. And it's essential that boards hold the executive accountable and accountable for the performance of all employees. It's a way to ensure and build confidence on the part of your funders that you are actually paying attention to the work that's being done. You have an executive director that you invest in, and it's in everyone's interest to help that person develop. So you want to have good accountabilities, and you want to make sure that your executive director is developing professionally and personally in the position. So those are some basic ways in which an organization would benefit from doing this. It benefits the supervisee in that it gives that person feedback. And if you're going to improve performance, you really want to get, as an employee, whether you're an executive or a staff person reporting to a supervisor, you really want to get direct, honest feedback. How am I doing? What could I do to improve my performance? It also benefits the supervisee in that very often they gain some insights into how they do their work. One of my most valuable performance reviews that I had in my experience as an executive director was one that really wasn't a glowing performance review, but it's one that I remember to this day, and this review happened about 25 years ago, but I actually learned something in that review that I didn't really know about myself. It gave me some insights into the way I was interacting, the way I was communicating with my staff, and it really opened up some eyes for me, which things that I had not seen before, and I found that incredibly valuable and helped me develop as a professional. Another question you would kick around in terms of the performance assessment, who takes the lead? So if you are the supervisor, it's obvious your job is you're the lead person in supervising the people who report to you. If it's a board of directors, you want to ask the same kind of question. Who should be the lead person on behalf of the board of directors to lead the performance assessment process? Typically, it would be the board chair. Sometimes it would be a governance committee chair. There are times when it might make sense to have a board member who might have some HR experience take the lead responsibility. So it's a matter of just being intentional about who will lead this effort. Who should participate is another one of those questions. If we're talking about an executive director being reviewed by a board, everyone on the board should participate. Absolutely everyone should participate. One of the golden rules when you think about who should participate is simply anyone who has an interest in the person being successful in that job. Justification enough to participate. If you're a supervisor and you're supervising 4 or 5 folks, you might invite others to participate in that as well. You may invite some of your peers, for example, or coworkers. The idea of doing peer reviews is another way in which you can integrate some of that into your process. There's no right or wrong process. The question about participation is simply a matter of being intentional about who are the people who would help give us the best performance review for the employee or the executive director. One of the things that the only area to be cautious about with participation is that if you were involving some of your coworkers in doing performance review or peer reviews, people have to understand that they're maybe sharing some input or giving you some feedback, but that they really are not the person who has the authority to make some decisions about this employee. So you want to be careful about not confusing who has what authority if you invite other folks to participate. The best tool to use, as I talked about earlier, the best tool would be a tool that's good enough, a tool that gives you what you want. The tool that I'm going to share with you is a very comprehensive tool. It's something that I think has real value, but it's very much, it's effective to the extent that the process is effective. When and how often is another question to be discussed. It's a good idea to do a performance review, a formal performance review, once a year. And to do it at a time that makes the most sense for the employee or for the organization. Typically, employees have a performance review on the anniversary of their hire. That's a good idea. You don't have to be locked into that. You can do it any way that it makes sense to you. And we're talking about, just to be clear, about a formal performance review. So this is not the ongoing interaction between a supervisor and a supervisee. This is about that formal process where once a year we step back and look completely at the whole picture. How formal should it be? You want this to be a formal process once a year. The end result is some written report that identifies strengths and weaknesses, identifies some performance goals going forward, and it's something you want documented and in your records. It's a way to make sure that you're crossing your T's and dotting your I's. One of the kind of side effects of doing formal performance reviews is that it helps build your credibility on the part of people who support your organization, your funders, your clients, your partners in the community. When you can communicate to all those folks that we take performance reviews seriously, that we do performance reviews in a formal way once a year, and that we strive to build a more evaluative culture in our workplace, this always puts you in a good position in terms of the community, in terms of your funders, and so on. There's often a question about compensation. Most conventionally, performance reviews are tied to compensation. There are some organizations that I've worked with, they've deliberately not tied performance reviews to compensation because they don't want the focus to be on money. If you're talking about a performance review where the employee gets focused on, am I going to get a raise or not? A raise, of course, is important, but it shouldn't be the end-all and be-all. It should be an effect of doing a performance review. There's a tendency sometimes for it to be all about whether I get a raise or not necessarily what could I do to be a better employee or a better or a more effective employee. What's the time frame for doing performance reviews? In my experience, if it's a board of directors doing a review of an executive director, my opinion, and it's my opinion coming at you, is that you ought to be able to begin it and end it in a very thoughtful and comprehensive way in a 30-day period. To drag it out too long, it becomes less and less valued and valuable. If you're talking about supervisors and supervisees, I believe it can be done easily in that time frame, if not less. So the time frame does matter, and the guiding principle for me is shorter rather than longer, but don't rush it. Take enough time to do it thoroughly, but don't let it drag on. If you have questions or comments, please feel free to click on your little hand icon and raise your hand, or pop something at the chat box. And don't worry about typing and typos and so on. Just type something in the chat box and we'll figure out. Okay, I'm going to move on. I'm going to look at the kind of areas you would include in the performance review. And this, again, is a comprehensive way of looking at an employee's performance. And what you'll see in this slide is actually the framework for the performance tool itself. So it always begins with annual performance goals. And so the process involves looking at those goals and reviewing the goals from the previous year, from the year that is just ending. And annual performance goals are a key part. It's a way of looking back and identifying what did I set out to accomplish and how well did I do on those various goals. So annual performance goals are part of the process. Annual performance goals, there's some more. I'll share some more with you as we go through some of these slides. But just briefly, you don't want to end up with a laundry list of goals here. These are the bigger, more important kind of things that need to get accomplished over the year when you develop them. You might look at 6 or 8 performance goals. You don't want a long, long list of performance goals. You want the things that are the most essential, most important. So you start with the performance goals. Then there are the core competencies, and these are competencies that really apply to virtually every job, or just about every job. So you look at person's performance in terms of their programs and services, in terms of planning, administration, financial management, and then their communications, public relations kind of aspects. So those are 5 areas of core competencies, and we'll get into those more when you look at some of the examples that I share with you from the tool that I use. In addition to the core competencies, there are the personal leadership qualities, and then there are interpersonal skills. These 2 things are things that matter. They matter in terms of performance, in terms of professional development. They are also things that are often qualities and skills that can't be taught to somebody. The person has to kind of have them already at some level. They can be developed a little bit, but you can't really teach them. And these are things like, well, I'll share some examples in a minute with you. And then in the performance review, you would look at the accomplishments and challenges. So it's a review of the year. What did this person accomplish that was significant? What were some of the significant challenges, and how did they address those challenges? There will always be challenges. So the question here is not, did you have any? The question is, what were they, and how did you manage them? How did you deal with those? How did you overcome those? And then planning for the future, which is the developing performance goals going forward. And performance goals, as I'll mention again later, but these are goals that you develop, the supervisor and the supervisee, or the board and the executive director, and they're developed mutually. You come to an agreement about these are the 6 or 7 most important goals that we need to pay attention to throughout the year. So those are the areas that you would include in a performance review. I'll take one little sidestep here and just talk about the core competencies for a minute. And they fall into a couple of different categories. And I think I shared this slide when I did the training on hiring practices. It's still this slide applies to that and this as well. So you got the knowledge. What's the person's knowledge about the mission, the organization, just general kind of knowledge, and the technical and transferable skills in order to do the job well. If you were hiring somebody, you'd be asking them, what have you done and what have you learned? These are the same kind of questions you'd be asking of somebody in a performance review process. But there's also these other 3 areas of competency. One is around self-concept. How does a person see themselves? What is their level of self-awareness? What motivates them in this job? Why this job, and what motivates you to do this job? And personal traits. Some people tend to be introverted, some tend to be extroverted. Having a good sense of where the person is and how they make that work for them is what matters. Being self-directed is another personal trait. And what the person's worldview is. Is this the person that sees the glass as half empty or half full? These are core competencies, and these 3 on the right-hand side are core competencies that are difficult to get at until you get to know the person. And then that's why it's really important in interviewing people that you get to this before you hire and get a good sense of these qualities here, so you can help ensure that you hire a good, an effective employee, somebody who will fit in your organization. This blue thing, if you consider this triangle an iceberg, I would appreciate it. I don't know how to make icebergs on a PowerPoint, so I'm calling this an iceberg. But I'll just want to put up here those 6 areas of competence again. Knowledge, skills, and experience. Folks, when you're evaluating some of the performance, you can evaluate these things. You can see these very clearly and very easily. But underneath them and underneath the surface of the ocean, which is this blue line, this iceberg is massive under here, and it is the area that has to do with the person, their self-concept, their level of self-awareness and their ability to manage themselves. And you'll find that when people have performance problems, when people seem to have a hard time in the job, it's mostly because of something down here. Most people have problems in their jobs not because they don't have the skill to do the job, but something down here, something in their personal traits perhaps. Somebody who is lazy, you cannot teach them to not be lazy. If somebody is self-directed, they're self-directed. It's hard to teach somebody how to be that way. So these are the things you want to pay attention to, and I wanted to just kind of take this little sidetrack just to kind of reflect on this whole notion of people and where their competencies lie. That other section has to do with leadership skills. So you want to get a sense of a person's commitment to the organization and the mission as part of the review process. Their ability to motivate and engage others. That's another thing you want to assess. You want to determine to what extent does this person have some strengths in this area. An ability to learn from past successes and failure. If we go back to the theme I mentioned earlier, it's really important that you help the employee get a sense of what did I do in the past, how am I part of my problems, how am I part of my successes, what can I learn from those things, and to encourage people to learn both from successes and from failures. A willingness to ask difficult questions and challenge organizational assumptions. So these are leadership skills. An awareness of trends and information in the external environment. What's going on out there that might affect our program or our agency? These are things that are really important leadership skills that really cannot be taught. A person has to have them, and you have to work with that person, help developing them. Sense of innovation and creativity is another. So as we kind of look at the components of a performance review, we have performance goals, we have the core competencies, we have these leadership skills, and then we have interpersonal skills. Does the person have good judgment in making decisions? And how can I help them develop that better? Do they have effective communication skills? Communication is a problem that comes up very often, and people say, well, the problem's with communication. Well, that's very vague. You really got to get at what does that actually mean? What are some of those behaviors? What are the ways in which this person is communicating or not communicating? So you look at communication skills, the ability to balance diverging and competing points of view. Many jobs, most jobs, requires an ability to balance some things that may not all be in sync, where you've got to really look at their competing interests and competing points of view and take those things into consideration. An ability to develop trusting relationships. I go back to what I said earlier about the performance review process is the context for a relationship. And in that relationship, you build trust. And when you build trust, you build a team. And that's what this is about. Ability to accept constructive criticism. It's another personal quality, to be able to hear some feedback from somebody that may not be all that positive, and rather than to get defensive, to simply say, maybe there's something to that. Maybe I am communicating less effectively than I think I am. Maybe I should consider developing some new skills in a certain area. But to be open to that criticism, and to accept that there's got to be something to that, and see what you can learn from that. So those are the areas that you'll find in the performance review. And again, to recap them, you have the performance goals from the previous year, you have those core competencies, you have leadership skills, interpersonal skills, and then you look at developing performance goals going forward. That's, in a sense, all the components within a performance review process. Now, I want to talk some about the tool that I use, and then we'll talk some about the process in which I use the tool. So on the tool that I use, I want to collect quantitative data, and I also want to get qualitative data. I want to be able to attach some numbers to performance, and I also want to hear comments. And so I want to have two kind of vehicles for that. So in terms of getting a quantitative data, I use a scaling of 1 to 5. So if there's a particular expectation, did the person fail to meet that expectation? Did they meet it partially? Did they meet the expectation? Did they partially exceed the expectation, or did they really exceed it completely? So this is a way to kind of scale someone's performance. And having numbers is a good way to kind of establish a baseline in performance. And if you use the same tool from year to year, then you could measure trend lines in terms of performance improving. So this is the way in which I frame the quantitative questions in the tool that I use. The next slide I'll share with you, if I draw your attention to these categories at the bottom here, these are the components of a performance review. And this is a sample taken from a review that I did with the board of directors around an executive director. And so these items across the bottom lay out those core competencies and leadership skills. Okay, administration, board relations, planning, these are core competencies. Interpersonal skills, financial management is a core competency. Performance goals, communication, public relations, fundraising was a core competency for this particular executive. Fundraising is typically part of the job of an executive. It may not be the part of other employees. You figure out what you need to plug into the tool that you use. But this is an example, and you'll see the scaling goes from 0 to 4, and this then kind of puts the performance measures or the scores in a descending order. So in terms of leadership skills, this person does very well there. They come down somewhat lower as they go across here. And fundraising, I can't see the fundraising is their lowest score, and they do all right in that area. So there's an example of the kind of score of a particular employee, or in this case it was an executive director. The tool that I use gets input from board members for an executive director, and it gets input from the executive himself or herself. So this grid reflects the performance goals, the core competencies coming down this left side, leadership skills, and interpersonal skills. And there are specific questions under each of these areas, which I'll share with you in a minute. And the person is scored, and these scores are the averages in those areas. So in planning, for example, there may be 5 or 6 questions in the tool. These are the averages. And this is the board average, which is 3.90 in this case. And for planning, the executive director scored himself or herself at 3.4. So here is a chart that I use for a couple of reasons. One is it gives us a measure of how the board sees the executive's performance on all these different indicators, and it also gives us a picture of how the executive sees himself or herself. So self-evaluation is a critical part of the performance review. The other thing that I find of value with this is it shows where there is congruence, or the degrees of congruence, the degrees to which there's agreement. If we look down here at interpersonal skills, the board scores and the executive director scores are very close, and they're both fairly high, which suggests that this board and the executive both, they all see this person as performing pretty well on those areas that have to do with interpersonal skills. So this is an example of the summary, or the kind of average of all the different categories within the tool itself. I have 2 slides that I'll share with you here that are examples of the specific categories, and I've extracted some of these questions to just share with you. So if we look at this category, underneath performance goals, one of the performance goals of this executive was to manage an approved budget. So it was important for this board to make sure that the executive was really paying attention to the budget on this particular year. So they made it a performance goal. At the end of the year, the board gave this person a score of 4.06. The executive director gave himself or herself a score of 1.0, which is relatively low. And then the gap shows the difference. So what this reflects is that the board is saying, you did a really good job on this, and the executive is saying, I think I could have done better. If you take another example, in the administration as one of the core competencies, one of the expectations was that this executive would manage the organization efficiently on a day-to-day basis. The board thought the executive did a really good job of that. The executive thought he did or she did pretty okay. Financial management would be another example, fundraising. So these are examples. Let me drop down to a box. Let's look at another goal here. Let's look at fundraising as an example. So the board established some performance goals, has an expectation around fundraising that the executive would motivate prospective donors by making a really strong case for the importance of the organization's work. The board thought the executive did an okay job with that, gave the person a 3. The executive sees himself or herself as, I could have done better in that regard. I didn't do that so well. So this is an example, this page, this slide is an example of some of the categories, goals or core competencies, and also some specific criteria where questions are developed and asked. And it gives us the perceptions of the board and the self-perceptions of the executive, and it also shows us where there may be a gap. And if there's a gap, then the next obvious question is, how do we explain the gap? Why is it that the board sees the performance so much higher than the executive? What's behind that? It leads to a dialogue, to a discussion, to a deeper understanding. So this is an example. I share another example with you. And this is kind of the flip side of the one we just saw. So here's an example where if we take the category, it's a core competency around communication and public relations, and the indicator, did this executive director establish and maintain positive relationships with individual and groups that impact the success of the organization? So that's what's being measured here. The board looked at the executive's performance and gave that person a fairly good score. The executive gave himself or herself a 5, the highest score. So this CEO is saying, I exceeded all expectations on this indicator. The board is saying you did very good, but not that you exceeded. So you see here a gap as well, and this gap shows the performance of the CEO's perceptions being higher on virtually every indicator, I believe, than the board's. Interpersonal skills, the ability to build trusting relationships. The board thought the executive did pretty good on that. The executive thought he did outstanding, or she did outstanding on that. And again, some other examples here. Let's look at another one here, planning, for example. The specific indicator under planning, did the executive engage the board in a meaningful strategic thinking about the organization? The board thought that the executive did pretty well on it. The executive thought, yeah, I not only met expectations, but I exceeded some of them. And you can see the gap here is much lower. Again, this gives you a picture of how the board sees the performance and how the CEO sees his or her own performance. And what you're looking for here is to get a sense of whether everyone is seeing the same thing or if there are variations in the perceptions. And if there are variations, that simply means we have to talk about this. What does this mean? Maybe if you take an example, well, here's an example here. If we look at administration, managed a successful delivery of programs. The board thought the executive did pretty good. The executive thought he exceeded expectations on this. Well, the question might be for the executive, maybe I'm not communicating as effectively as I could be to the board about how well I am doing in managing our programs every day. So it's a tool to be used to develop professionally and to improve performance. So that's a sample that I extracted from a tool that I use. If you do have questions, I remind you again, please feel free to push that little icon that raises your hand, or comments, please feel to make them, and use the chat box as well if you'd like. Okay, we'll move on, and we'll look now at the steps in the performance assessment process. And these are the steps that I follow. And I think it's a fairly comprehensive way of beginning the process and going through it. So one part to the process is the self-evaluation. So the first step is you say to your executive director, if you're the board, or if you're a supervisor, you say to the supervisee, I want you to look at your job description. I'd like you to review it. I'd like you to make any revisions. Your job description needs to be accurate, and it has to accurately reflect the duties and responsibility, what the expectations are of your job. So I want you to review it and revise it. And this is important because a lot of jobs change from year to year. You want to have you always want to have an up-to-date, accurate description of what the job is. The other thing that you do is encourage the supervisee, or if it's a board, you encourage the executive to really sit down and reflect on this year and make some written comments. So if it were the board, the message to the executive director would be, we want you to take some time. Don't just squeeze us in between meetings. take some time to sit down and really reflect on what you see are some successes and accomplishments. What are some things that you look back on the year and feel disappointed about? In terms of your performance goals, review the performance goals we developed last year and reflect on how well you did on those. What were some things that you could have done better? What are some areas where you really think you excelled? But really start that process of reflecting. And then to look at personal and professional goals as well. So the idea of self-evaluation is really important here. And for some executives and for some employees, you really have to encourage them to sit down and take the time to do that. Some folks are not naturally reflective, but this is an important part of the process. And it's also one of those steps that gets the person out of autopilot. This is the time it's not business as usual. It's like sit down, shut the door, put the phone on answering machine, and just reflect on this past year. A second step in the process is to provide feedback. So we provide the feedback, and again, giving this person input from everyone who has a stake in the person being successful. So feedback in this case, if we were talking about a board of directors giving feedback to the executive, it would be a board using the tool, the samples of which I shared with you. So this is a time for everyone on the board to reflect on the year, reflect on this person's performance, and give them feedback. Fill out the questionnaire, add written comments. And to do this and to get feedback, there are multiple approaches. So as I was just saying, the assessment tool or questionnaire is what I was referring to. There are variations on this. You can also, if you were board of directors, you could also ask a board member to interview some direct reports. You could interview individual board members. You could do this in a narrative way if you'd like to. If you're a supervisor and you're doing this with supervisees, you can do it simply in an interview. There are many ways you can do this. But the point in all this being to make sure you have some good feedback loops. The third step in the process is the dialogue. So if we were looking at using the assessment tool and going through all that data, it would all have to be synthesized and compiled and organized into some kind of report. And the supervisor, so in this case, the supervisor being the board or the board chair, would really look at all that data and put together a report and then sit down with the supervisee, in this case the executive director, to really talk about these are the things that the board is seeing that are strengths and areas of weakness. These are the things that you see as your own strengths and weaknesses. What are the areas where we see things similarly? How can we build more congruence? How can we become more aligned in what we see as strengths and weaknesses? And then developing performance goals mutually going forward. So that would be another step in this process. So to back up, we're looking at self-reflection, self-evaluation. Then we're looking at feedback from anybody who has an interest in the person being successful in the job, to a dialogue between the supervisor and the supervisee. Then to building in accountabilities. So these are the kind of ongoing meetings. So if you're the supervisor, you would meet with the supervisee on a regular basis. Your performance goals that get developed as part of this process would be part of those meetings. When you meet on a regular basis, this is how you attend to that relationship. And it really means this is from time to time, not only how are you performing, but how are we doing in this partnership. I'm your supervisor. I have a vested interest in your performance improving. We all gain when we get better at what we do. There's a guiding principle in all of this process, and that is there really should be no surprises. So if you have an employee, for example, and their performance is starting to lag, you don't wait till the end of the year and spring it on them. You deal with issues as they come up. There should be no surprises in a performance review. It's something to always strive for. It's the most respectful way to do this work. If there's something going on with an employee, don't wait till the end and tell them they did a lousy job. You want to start that process early on. If their performance starts to lag, you want to start talking about what's going on. And then finally, there's a written report that includes the performance goals. So those are the steps in the process that I use. The other part to the tool, and then this really important step here, which is evaluate the evaluation. So anytime I work with a board and they're evaluating an executive director, at the end of the whole process, we'll step back and say, okay, how did we do? Did this tool work for you? Could we refine the tool? Was our process solid? Could we have done it more efficiently? With the executive director, how did this have value for you? How could we have this be more valuable? How could we make this a better process and have more meaning for you, and so you can improve your performance? So evaluating the evaluation is a good idea. Part of the tool and part of the process involves that reflecting back, looking at accomplishments. So questions that I would ask or have as part of a tool, and these can be asked in an interview or they can be part of your tool. What were the most significant accomplishments that the supervisee in the past year? What were some of the difficult issues that perhaps his or her department had to face? Were there any legal, ethical, or oversight issues that came up during this year, and if so, how did they get addressed? What are the two most important organizational priorities for the supervisee going forward? So if this were the executive director, it would be, what are the two most important organizational priorities for the executive director going forward? What are the two most important leadership tasks for the executive director going forward? And what are the two most important professional development goals for the supervisee or the executive going forward, whoever it may be? And these are key here. These are really key because they sort out the organizational from the leadership from the professional development parts of the performance review. And you're reviewing all these things with an eye towards improving performance going forward. When you look at the annual performance goals, they really are the framework for ongoing supervision throughout the year. So they're developed mutually between the supervisor and the supervisee, and they become the tool that you use when you meet. So from time to time, if you're the supervisor and you meet with the supervisee, you sit down with them, use them as a guide. They're also a tool for holding the person accountable. It's an excellent way to keep focus on the bigger issues. And remember, the performance goals is not a laundry list of things to do. There are 6 or 7 or 8 really important things that have to get accomplished. So having this tool and using it when you meet in individual supervision throughout the year helps you focus on those issues. And it addresses the organization, it addresses programs, it addresses finances, and it also addresses professional development. Again, you have an investment in this employee, whether it's a staff person or whether it's the executive director. Now, I talked earlier about performance goals, and I shared the acronym SMART with you. And I'm not sure if folks know this, but this I find to be a really good tool when trying to formulate performance goals. So we'll lay out the acronym here. They have to be specific, so they have to clearly define boundaries to provide an incentive and opportunity to reach higher. The performance goals have to be specific. They have to be measurable. You can't ask somebody to just get better. You have to find a way to measure. People often say if you don't measure it, if you don't have a way to measure it, it'll never improve. So you want to try to build in some metric that these goals are agreed upon. As I said, they're developed mutually between the supervisor and the supervisee, that they're realistic. I mean, you want to make the goals attainable, with the resources that you have, not unrealistic though. Things that really, some people use the word stretch. Make the goals a stretch. And that they're time-based to clarify when the results are expected. So as you develop goals or performance goals with your staff person, with your supervisee going forward, this tool might be a tool that would help you think about how to craft those so that they're succinct statements that capture these specific, measurable, agreed upon, realistic, and time-based variables. And I'll share with you on the next slide some examples from each of those. And this is from Mintz and Pearson, and so I want to make sure I credited those two folks. Here are some examples, and these are examples from the performance review that I shared in this webinar already that have to do with an executive director being reviewed by a board. So there were this executive director, these are some examples. There are 2, 4, 6, 8 performance goals, and they somehow fall into these categories evenly. So in terms of organization going forward, one of the goals is complete a strategic planning and finalize annual operation plan. So this is something, if you think about the SMART acronym, this is something that's specific, it's measurable, it was developed by the board and the executive, and it's achievable. Organize an annual staff retreat is another example of an organizational performance goal. In this case, the board had two specific expectations around performance, around finances with this executive. Increase the operating reserve by 10%. Again, it was very important that this get done, and it's measurable. At the end of the year, you can measure whether that was accomplished. During the year, in regular supervision meetings, you can ask the question, how are we doing and moving towards this target? Balancing the budget is another one. So I have to walk through these with you. Here's this organization. They were hiring the first deputy director. It was something everybody agreed had to get done. It was vitally important. They made it a performance goal, easily measured whether you've done it or not. And lastly, let me draw your attention to the personal example, because there's something here that's really important in this process. In this case, because of some of the weaknesses that this executive had around some of the parts of his job, the board wanted to make sure that he brought on a coach to help him develop his leadership skills more. So the board said, let's create a goal around this so we make sure it gets done and we can measure it. We want to make sure that you're getting the kind of coaching support you need so you can improve your skills around leadership. And then the other thing in this executive's case was the board had an expectation that this executive was putting in way too much time and his life was out of balance. So they're saying, we're going to make a performance goal around this because we care about you as a whole person. We want to make sure that you bring some balance into your life. So we're telling you, make it a goal, and we're going to measure it, and we're going to help you get there. So this is really a goal, professional goal, all tied together. So those are some examples of those kind of SMART goals as you develop them. The tool itself, let me just make a few comments about this. And some I said already, the tool supports the process. There's no perfect tool. Quantitative data is important, and a tool allows for that. Qualitative data is key. It's where you really get at the substance of some of the issues. Supervisor input, and possibly from others, is another part of the process. Supervisee's input, which is the self-evaluation part. Excuse me. You look at the performance over the past year, and you look forward, mutually developing goals going forward. So the assessment tool is about that. A few other quick slides here I'll just share with you. Is that you're talking about this interdependent relationship between the supervisor and supervisee. And there's an interesting kind of irony around interdependence. One is that you're dealing with diverse people, so you may be supervising somebody with a very different kind of personality than you have. It's diversity. It's a fact of life. Excuse me. And interdependence. You're about building these cooperative relationships with people. This is about a partnership that you build with the person you supervise. And excuse my coughing. Last slide, and I've shared this in some other webinars, but these are 10 commitments for making a partnership better. Keep everyone focused on the mission. Define and respect each other's roles. Avoid territorial behavior. This is about two people coming together, or a board and an executive coming together to work better as a team, to move the mission forward, to make sure the people we serve get served better. Adds innovative value. Help to make the board stronger. In this case, in my mind, leaders are always bridge builders, whether it's a board and an executive or whether you're the supervisor working with the supervisee. You're about building bridges between you and that person. Another commitment is to develop a positive dynamic between the board and the chief executive, or to develop a positive dynamic between the supervisor and supervisee. Make communication a priority. Some people, they say the mantra is communicate, communicate, communicate. Pay attention to that. Make sure that you're really working at communicating. Maintaining a united front. Always come together, remembering that you're a team. Protecting and supporting each other, and keeping passions and emotions in check. People do have tempers, and sometimes passions and tempers rise. This is something that's not necessarily bad or good. It's just something that needs to be managed. Our emotions need to be channeled and harnessed in a way that they serve our purpose so we can be more effective in our jobs. And that's adapted from these two folks down here, those 10 commitments. And the last slide then, just sharing some of your thoughts and reflections. We have about 1 or 2 minutes. There haven't been any questions or anything put in the chat box, but I would invite you, if you have a question or comment at this time, please feel free to put that in there or to raise your hand. And while I give you a minute to reflect on that, I covered a lot of ground today. If you have questions or like more details, please feel free to reach out to me, and here's the email address. As I said, I would respond to all your emails. Also, as a reminder, there'll be an evaluation form or a link to one that Kimberly will kindly post for us and get to you all. Please take the time to evaluate today's webinar. Your input really is appreciated. I will absolutely look at every comment you make and take it to heart. And I guess the last thing I'll just say is a pitch for the webinar next month, which is going to be on conflicts of interest. And I think Kimberly is going to put it up here on the screen now. I would encourage you to consider participating in this and bring as many board members and staff that may have relevance as possible. Conflicts of interest is one of the issues that really a common issue for urban programs all across the country from what I've seen. Some manage their conflicts of interest very well, some struggle with it. So this webinar is really designed to look at ways to deal with conflicts of interest that are constructive and lead to good outcomes for your board, for your staff, and for your organization and your clients. So there, I'm done with my pitch. I appreciate all your participation. I hope that this was of some value and interest to you all. And again, invite you to reach out to me anytime. And with that, we'll say good afternoon to everybody. And thank you again, Kimberly.
You're welcome. Thank you, Tony. Have a good day.
Thank you.